In the grand halls of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal tradition echo through marble corridors, one particular afternoon in 2021 would become etched in the heart of a young princess forever. Lady Louise Windsor, then 17 years old, had no idea that her beloved grandfather, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was preparing something that would change her life in ways she could never imagine. It wasn't a tiara encrusted with diamonds, nor a piece of priceless artwork that had hung in royal residences for generations. It wasn't even money or property, though the Duke certainly had plenty to offer. Instead, what Prince Philip chose to give his granddaughter was something far more valuable than any material possession, something that would connect her to her heritage, challenge her spirit, and teach her lessons that no classroom could ever provide. This is the extraordinary true story of a grandfather's final gift to his granddaughter, a present so unexpected and meaningful that it would reshape Lady Louise's entire future and reveal the depth of love and wisdom that Prince Philip, known publicly for his sometimes gruff exterior, held in his heart for his family. It's a story about tradition, courage, and the special bond between a war hero grandfather and a shy young woman who was about to discover strengths she never knew she possessed. As the world mourned the passing of Prince Philip in April 2021, Lady Louise was quietly inheriting something that would honor his memory in the most beautiful way possible and change her life forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as 17-year-old Lady Louise Windsor made her way to the stable yard, her riding boots clicking softly against the ancient cobblestones. It was early March 2021, and the crisp air carried the promise of spring, though the weight of recent months seemed to hang heavily over the royal household. Prince Philip, her grandfather, had been in and out of the hospital, and everyone in the family was acutely aware that time was precious. Louise had always been different from other members of her generation in the royal family. While her cousins Prince William and Prince Harry had grown up in the intense glare of media attention, Louise had been largely shielded from public scrutiny. Born with a condition called esotropia that affected her vision, she had undergone several eye surgeries as a child, which had made her naturally more introspective and observant than many of her peers. Her parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, Countess of Wessex, had made deliberate choices to give their children as normal a childhood as possible, even refusing royal titles for Louise and her younger brother James until they came of age. But there was one person in the royal family who had always seen something special in Louise, something that others might have overlooked. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, had been watching his granddaughter carefully over the years, noting her quiet determination, her love of horses, and, most importantly, her genuine character. Unlike some family members who might have been drawn to the glamorous aspects of royal life, Louise seemed to find joy in simpler pursuits. She loved spending time outdoors, had a natural affinity for animals, and possessed a gentle strength that reminded Philip of someone very special from his past. The Duke of Edinburgh had lived an extraordinary life. Born Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark in 1921, he had experienced exile from his homeland as an infant, attended school in Britain and Germany, and served with distinction in the Royal Navy during World War II. He had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, had been present at some of the most significant moments in modern history, and had supported Queen Elizabeth II through nearly 70 years of marriage and her entire reign as monarch. At 99 years old, he had seen countless changes in the world, the monarchy, and his own family. But there was one passion that had remained constant throughout Philip's life, one pursuit that had shaped his character and given him some of his greatest joys and proudest achievements. Carriage driving had become Philip's obsession in his later years, particularly after he retired from polo in his 70s. What had started as a way to remain active and competitive had evolved into something much deeper, a connection to horses, to tradition, and to the land itself that went to the very core of who he was. Philip's love affair with carriage driving had begun in the 1970s when he was introduced to the sport by Colonel Sir Mike Parker, his former private secretary, and lifelong friend. At first, it had been simply another challenge for the perpetually active Duke, who had never been content to sit still. But as he began to understand the intricacies of the sport, the precise communication required between driver and horses, the split-second timing needed to navigate challenging obstacles, the deep trust that had to be built between human and animal, Philip discovered that carriage driving offered something unique. The sport required not just physical skill and courage, but also patience, intuition, and a deep understanding of horse psychology. A carriage driver had to think several steps ahead, reading the terrain, the weather, the mood of the horses, and countless other variables simultaneously. It was chess played at high speed with living pieces, and Philip found himself utterly captivated by its complexity. More than that, carriage driving connected Philip to a tradition that stretched back centuries. Horse-drawn vehicles had been the primary means of transportation for the wealthy and powerful for millennia, and the skills required to handle a four-in-hand team were the same ones that had been passed down from generation to generation of coachmen, horsemen, and nobility. When Philip took the reins of his carriage, he was participating in a living link to the past that felt both timeless and deeply meaningful. Over the years, Philip had competed in carriage driving events across Europe and beyond, representing Britain in world championships and European championships. He had written books about the sport, helped to develop new techniques and equipment, and become one of its most respected ambassadors. His green Hermes carriage became a familiar sight at events like the Royal Windsor Horse Show, where spectators would gather to watch the Duke of Edinburgh navigate challenging courses with the precision and skill of someone half his age. But beyond the competition and the accolades, what Philip loved most about carriage driving was the peace it brought him. Out on the courses at Windsor Great Park or Sandringham, with only the sound of hooves on earth and the jingle of harness, Philip found a tranquility that was rare in his official life. There were no photographers, no protocol officers, no endless rounds of meetings and ceremonial duties. There was just him, his horses, and the eternal challenge of working in harmony with these magnificent animals. As Philip's health began to decline in his late 90s, his family watched with concern as he stubbornly continued to drive his carriage around the royal estates. There had been accidents over the years. A spectacular crash at the 1994 World Championships in which Philip had been thrown from his carriage, but had refused medical attention, insisting instead on walking back to inspect his horses. Even in his 90s, he continued to drive, though family members worried constantly about his safety. But Philip was not ready to give up the thing that gave his life such meaning. Instead, he began to think about legacy, about what would happen to his beloved horses and carriages when he was no longer able to care for them. The Duke had always been a practical man, someone who planned ahead and thought carefully about the future. And as he considered his options, his thoughts kept returning to Louise. He had been watching her carefully during family gatherings, noting how she interacted with the horses at Balmoral and Sandringham. Unlike some of her cousins, who might pet a horse's nose for a photo opportunity before quickly moving on, Louise seemed genuinely interested in the animals themselves. She would spend long minutes studying their conformation, asking questions about their breeding and training, and showing a natural understanding of horse behavior that couldn't be taught. There was something else that Philip recognized in Louise, something that perhaps others in the family hadn't yet seen. Despite her quiet demeanor and her tendency to stay in the background during public events, Louise possessed an inner strength and determination that reminded Philip of another young woman he had known many decades earlier. Like her grandmother, the Queen, Louise had that particular combination of gentleness and steel that Philip had learned to recognize and respect. The Queen herself had been a shy young woman when Philip first met her, someone who preferred horses and dogs to crowds and ceremonies. But Philip had seen in her the qualities that would make her not just a good queen, but a great one. And now, looking at Louise, he was beginning to see similar qualities emerging. The question was whether Louise herself recognized these abilities and whether she would have the opportunity to develop them. It was during one of their conversations in the stable yard at Windsor that Philip first broached the subject that had been occupying his thoughts. Louise had been helping to groom one of the carriage horses, working with the quiet competence that had become her hallmark, when Philip approached her with a question that would change everything. "Louise," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive mixture of authority and affection that his family knew so well, "how would you feel about learning to drive?" The question seemed simple enough, but Louise immediately understood that her grandfather wasn't talking about learning to drive a car. At 17, she already had her driver's license and had been driving around the royal estates for months. No, this was something entirely different, something that would require not just courage and skill, but a commitment that would last far beyond her teenage years. Louise looked up from the horse she had been grooming, meeting her grandfather's keen blue eyes with her own steady gaze. There was something in his expression that told her this wasn't a casual suggestion, but rather an invitation into something important, something that mattered deeply to him. "I think I like that very much, Grandpa," she replied quietly. And Philip felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that he had made the right choice. What Louise didn't know, and what Philip hadn't yet told her, was that this was far more than just an offer of riding lessons. Philip was considering something unprecedented in the history of the royal family, something that would require Louise to step forward in a way that might not come naturally to her, but which Philip believed she was uniquely suited for. The Duke of Edinburgh was thinking about passing on not just his knowledge and his passion, but his entire carriage driving establishment, his horses, his carriages, his position as one of the sport's leading figures. It was a responsibility that would transform Louise from a relatively unknown member of the royal family into someone with a very public role and a very specific mission. But first, Philip needed to be certain that Louise had not just the interest, but the aptitude and the character required for what he had in mind. The next few weeks would be crucial, as Philip began Louise's education not just in the technical aspects of carriage driving, but in the deeper lessons that the sport could teach about leadership, responsibility, and the profound connection between human and animal. As March turned toward April, and as the signs of spring became more evident in the grounds around Windsor Castle, Philip and Louise began spending more and more time together in the stable yard and on the driving courses that Philip had spent decades perfecting. For Louise, it was simply time spent with a grandfather she had always admired but perhaps hadn't fully understood. For Philip, it was something much more profound, the beginning of a legacy that would ensure that everything he had learned and loved about carriage driving would continue long after he was gone. Neither of them knew that time was running shorter than they imagined, or that their conversations in the stable yard would soon become precious memories that Louise would treasure for the rest of her life. But both of them sensed that something important was beginning, something that would connect them not just as grandfather and granddaughter, but as partners in preserving a tradition that had shaped Philip's life and would now, in ways Louise couldn't yet imagine, begin to shape hers. The ancient stable yard at Windsor Castle had witnessed countless moments of history, but few as quietly significant as the morning Louise Windsor first climbed into the driving seat of her grandfather's carriage. It was late March 2021, and the early spring air carried a crispness that made the horses eager to move, their breath visible in small puffs as they stamped and shifted in their harnesses. Philip stood beside the carriage, his weathered hands resting on the leather reins, watching as Louise settled herself into the seat that had been his domain for nearly 5 decades. Despite being 99 years old, Philip still cut an impressive figure. His back was straight, his eyes were sharp, and his presence commanded the same respect from horses and humans alike that it always had. But those closest to him could see the subtle signs that his strength was waning, making these lessons with Louise all the more precious. "The most important thing to understand," Philip said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of experience, "is that you're not controlling 4 individual horses. You're communicating with a team that has to think and move as one entity. Every signal you send through these reins travels instantly to their mouths, and they'll respond to the slightest change in pressure or direction. Louise listened intently, her hands hovering over the reins as Philip explained the complex system of communication that made carriage driving possible. Unlike riding a single horse, where the connection was primarily between rider and mount, carriage driving required the driver to maintain contact with four horses simultaneously, reading their individual personalities while keeping them unified in purpose. The horses Philip had chosen for Louise's first lesson were his most reliable team, for fell ponies that had been with him for years. Balmoral Nevis, the lead horse, was a sturdy black gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm temperament that made him perfect for training new drivers. Beside him stood Not Lost Storm, a gray mare whose gentle nature belied the strength needed to pull the heavy carriage across challenging terrain. The two wheelers positioned closest to the carriage were Brackenwell Prince and Windsor Storm, both experienced competitors who understood their jobs so well they could practically drive themselves. "Start with the lightest possible touch," Philip instructed as Louise finally took the reins in her hands. "These horses have been trained to respond to whispers, not shouts. Feel the contact with each horse's mouth through the reins, but don't grip so tightly that you cut off that communication." Louise's first attempts were tentative, her movements careful and measured as she tried to process all the information Philip was giving her while managing four sets of reins and maintaining her balance in the swaying carriage. The fell ponies, sensing her inexperience, tested her with small acts of independence. Nevis pulling slightly to the left toward a patch of grass, Storm shifting her pace to fall slightly behind the others. "They're seeing what they can get away with," Philip observed, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Horses are like children sometimes. They'll push boundaries until they find someone who knows how to set them. Show them you're paying attention." The next hour was a masterclass not just in carriage driving technique, but in horsemanship at its highest level. Philip demonstrated how tiny adjustments in rein pressure could communicate complex instructions to the team, how the driver's posture and energy affected the horse's performance, and how reading the landscape ahead allowed the driver to prepare the horses for changes in pace or direction long before they became necessary. But beyond the technical instruction, Philip was teaching Louise something much deeper about the relationship between human and horse. As they drove through Windsor Great Park, following the familiar routes that Philip had perfected over decades of practice, he shared stories that revealed his profound understanding of these animals and the sport that had become his passion. "I once competed in a championship where the course designer had created what seemed like an impossible combination," Philip told Louise as they navigated a gentle turn near the lake. The approach to a water obstacle was on a steep downhill slope, and most drivers were having their horses refuse or go around the outside boundaries. But I had been watching how my horses responded to different approaches throughout the day, and I realized that if I gave them their heads about 50 yards before the obstacle and let them choose their own pace down the hill, they would naturally find the right rhythm to tackle the water. Louise listened, fascinated, as Philip described how that moment of trust, allowing the horses to use their own intelligence and instincts rather than trying to micromanage every step, had led to a clear round and eventually a championship title. It was a lesson that went far beyond carriage driving, touching on fundamental questions about leadership, trust, and the delicate balance between control and freedom. As the days passed and the lessons continued, Louise began to understand why carriage driving had captured her grandfather's imagination so completely. There is something almost meditative about the rhythm of hooves on gravel, the gentle creaking of leather harness, and the subtle dance of communication between driver and horses. But there was also an element of constant challenge that kept the mind fully engaged, requiring split-second decisions and absolute concentration. Philip's teaching style was demanding but patient. He had no tolerance for carelessness or inattention, but he also understood that learning to drive a four-in-hand was one of the most complex skills in the equestrian world. He would stop the carriage immediately if he saw Louise losing concentration, making her analyze what had gone wrong and how to correct it before continuing. Driving is like conducting an orchestra, he explained during one memorable lesson. You have to be aware of what each section is doing while maintaining the overall rhythm and harmony of the performance. But unlike a conductor, if you make a mistake, it's not just the music that suffers. You and your horses could be seriously hurt. The lessons took place not just in the formal driving courses Philip had constructed around Windsor, but also on the public roads and paths of the royal estates. This was where Louise learned one of the most important aspects of carriage driving: how to manage the unpredictable elements that could never be controlled or anticipated. A sudden flock of geese rising from the lake, a jogger appearing around a blind corner, a helicopter passing overhead. Any of these could spook even the most experienced horses, and Philip taught Louise how to read the signs of rising tension in her team and how to respond before a small concern became a dangerous situation. The secret, Philip told her during one particularly challenging session when Storm had been disturbed by a low-flying aircraft, is to stay calm yourself. Horses are incredibly sensitive to human emotion. If you become tense or frightened, they'll feel it immediately, and their own anxiety will increase. But if you remain confident and relaxed, they'll take their cues from you. It was during these early lessons that Louise began to understand something important about her grandfather's character that perhaps even some family members hadn't fully appreciated. Philip's reputation for being direct, sometimes even blunt, in his public interactions was well established. But with his horses, and now with Louise as she learned to work with them, he displayed a patience and gentleness that revealed another side of his personality entirely. She watched as Philip worked with a young horse that was being introduced to carriage work for the first time, noting how he took endless time to build the animal's confidence, how he celebrated small successes, and how he never showed frustration when progress was slow. It was a side of Philip that the public rarely saw, but which Louise began to realize was perhaps the truest expression of who he was as a person. The lessons weren't limited to the technical aspects of driving. Philip also began sharing with Louise the broader context of the sport, its history and traditions, and the community of people who had dedicated their lives to preserving these ancient skills. He told her about the great drivers of the past, the families who had maintained carriage driving traditions for generations, and the ongoing efforts to ensure that these skills would survive in an increasingly mechanized world. This isn't just about sport or recreation, Philip explained as they walked through the carriage house, examining the various vehicles that represented decades of his involvement in driving. These skills, this knowledge about horses and harness and the relationship between humans and animals, it's part of our heritage. If we don't pass it on, it disappears forever. Louise began to understand that her grandfather wasn't just teaching her to drive a carriage. He was initiating her into a tradition that he considered worth preserving. The responsibility was both exciting and daunting, particularly for a 17-year-old who had never sought the spotlight or considered herself a natural leader. But as the weeks progressed, Louise found herself drawn deeper into the world that Philip was revealing to her. The early morning sessions in the stable yard, preparing the horses and checking the harness, became a peaceful start to days that might otherwise be filled with the pressures of school and family obligations. The afternoon driving sessions provided a physical and mental challenge that was unlike anything she had experienced before. Most importantly, the time spent with her grandfather, learning not just about carriage driving, but about his philosophy of life, his memories of decades of experience, and his hopes for the future, became precious beyond words. Louise had always known that Philip was an important figure in British history, but these private lessons revealed the depth of his knowledge, the breadth of his interests, and the genuine warmth he felt for his family. As March moved toward April, Philip began to introduce more advanced concepts into Louise's training. He taught her about competition driving, explaining the intricate rules and strategies that govern events like the World Championships he had competed in for decades. He showed her how to read a course, planning the optimal route through complex combinations of obstacles, and how to adjust her driving style to match different types of terrain and weather conditions. But perhaps most importantly, Philip began to talk with Louise about the future, about what might happen to his driving establishment when he was no longer able to maintain it himself. These conversations were never explicit. Philip was not one to dwell on mortality or to burden his granddaughter with heavy expectations. But Louise began to sense that these lessons were about more than just teaching her a new skill. They were about preparing her for a responsibility that might one day be hers. The transformation in Louise during these weeks was remarkable to those who knew her well. The shy, reserved teenager who had always preferred to remain in the background was developing a new confidence and sense of purpose. The concentration required for carriage driving was teaching her to trust her instincts and make quick decisions, while the responsibility for 4 powerful horses was building her leadership skills in ways that no classroom instruction could match. Philip, despite his advancing age and declining health, seemed energized by these teaching sessions. Family members noticed that he was more animated during dinner conversations when he could share stories of Louise's progress, more eager to plan the next day's activities when they included time at the driving courses. But time was running shorter than either of them realized. As April arrived and the spring weather made driving conditions ideal, Philip pushed to accelerate Louise's training, introducing more complex scenarios and beginning to talk seriously about the possibility of Louise taking a more public role in the carriage driving world. It was during one of these April lessons, as they drove through the spectacular countryside around Windsor with the fell ponies moving in perfect harmony, that Philip made a comment that would prove to be prophetic. "You know, Louise," he said, his eyes focused on the path ahead, but his voice carrying a weight that made her listen carefully, "I think you might have found something here that could be really important for you. Not just as a hobby or a family tradition, but as something that could give your life real purpose and meaning." Louise nodded, feeling the truth of his words, but not yet understanding just how prophetic they would prove to be, or how soon she would be called upon to step into a role that would honor her grandfather's memory, while creating her own unique path forward. The first week of April 2021 brought unseasonably warm weather to Windsor Castle, and with it, a sense of urgency that Philip himself seemed to feel more acutely than anyone else. Those closest to the Duke of Edinburgh noticed that he was pushing himself harder than usual, spending longer hours in the stable yard, taking more time with each of Louise's lessons, and speaking with an intensity that suggested he was trying to convey years of knowledge in whatever time remained. Louise had become remarkably proficient in just a few weeks of intensive instruction. Her natural feel for horses, combined with the careful foundation Philip had built, meant that she was already handling the 4 in hand with a confidence that impressed even the experienced grooms who had worked with Philip for decades. But her grandfather wasn't content with simply teaching her to drive. He was preparing her for something much more significant. It was on a particularly beautiful morning, with the early sun casting long shadows across the driving course, and the birds singing in the ancient oaks that surrounded Windsor Great Park, that Philip finally revealed the full scope of what he had been planning. They had completed their usual training session, working through a complex series of obstacles that tested both Louise's technical skills and her ability to read her horse's moods and energy levels. As they brought the team back to the stable yard, Philip asked Louise to join him in his study, a room that few family members were invited to enter. The walls were lined with photographs from decades of carriage driving competitions. Shelves held books on horsemanship and driving technique, and a large desk was covered with papers related to various equestrian organizations and events. "Louise," Philip began, settling into his familiar chair with a slight grimace that he tried to hide, "I want to talk to you about something important. What we've been doing these past weeks isn't just about teaching you a new skill. I've been watching you carefully, and I believe you have the potential to carry on something that has been central to my life for nearly 50 years. He gestured toward a cabinet that held an impressive collection of trophies and medals, evidence of his success in carriage driving competitions around the world. But Louise could see that this wasn't about personal achievement. There was something deeper in her grandfather's expression, something that spoke to legacy and responsibility. These horses, this knowledge, this entire establishment that I've built here at Windsor, Philip continued, it needs someone to take care of it when I'm no longer able to do so. I've been thinking about this for months, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. You're the one who should inherit all of this. The magnitude of what Philip was proposing began to sink in as he explained his vision. This wasn't just about inheriting some horses and carriages. Philip was suggesting that Louise take over his position as one of the leading figures in international carriage driving. She would inherit not just his establishment, but his responsibilities to various equestrian organizations, his role in promoting and developing the sport, and his position as a guardian of traditions that stretched back centuries. But, Grandpa, Louise said quietly, I've only been learning for a few weeks. Surely there are people with much more experience who would be better suited for this kind of responsibility. Philip leaned forward, his keen blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that reminded Louise why he had been such a formidable figure in both military and civilian life. Experience can be gained, Louise. What can't be taught is character, and you have the character for this. I've seen how you work with the horses, how you listen, how you learn. More importantly, I've seen how they respond to you. Over the next hour, Philip outlined a vision that was both thrilling and daunting. He had been in contact with officials from the International Driving Federation, discussing the possibility of establishing a new competitive program that would encourage young people to take up carriage driving. Louise, with her royal connections and natural ability, would be perfectly positioned to lead this initiative. The sport needs fresh blood, Philip explained. Most of his serious competitors are my age or older. If carriage driving is going to survive and thrive in the 21st century, it needs ambassadors who can connect with the younger generation. You could be that ambassador, Louise. The conversation revealed the depth of Philip's strategic thinking about the future of carriage driving. He had been quietly working behind the scenes for months, using his influence and connections to create opportunities that would allow Louise to step into a leadership role despite her youth and relative inexperience. Several major competitions had already expressed interest in having Louise participate, understanding that her royal status would bring valuable publicity to the sport. But Philip was also realistic about the challenges Louise would face. Taking on this role would mean accepting a level of public attention that she had spent her entire life avoiding. It would require her to travel internationally, to give interviews and speeches, and to represent not just her family, but an entire sporting community. For a teenager who preferred to remain in the background, it was a dramatic transformation. I'm not going to lie to you, Louise, Philip said with characteristic honesty. This won't be easy. You'll be scrutinized in ways that might be uncomfortable. People will question whether you deserve these opportunities because of your age and your family connections. But I believe you have the strength to handle all of that. And more importantly, I believe this could give your life a sense of purpose that nothing else could match. As they talked, Philip shared stories from his own experience that revealed both the rewards and the difficulties of being a public representative of carriage driving. He told her about competitions where mechanical failures had left him stranded miles from home, about diplomatic events where his knowledge of horses had helped break the ice with foreign dignitaries, and about the deep satisfaction that came from preserving and promoting traditions that connected the modern world to its agricultural past. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sophie, Countess of Wessex, Louise's mother, who had come looking for her daughter. Philip invited Sophie to join the discussion, and Louise watched as her grandfather explained his proposal to her mother with the same mixture of enthusiasm and practicality that had characterized his presentation to Louise. Sophie's reaction was complex. As a mother, she was concerned about the pressure that such a public role might place on her daughter. But she also recognized the unique opportunity that Philip was offering, and she could see how much the past weeks of training had already begun to transform Louise's confidence and sense of herself. It's ultimately Louise's decision, Sophie said finally, but I can see how much this means to both of you. And I have to admit, I've never seen Louise as engaged and excited about anything as she has been about these driving lessons. The three of them spent the rest of the morning walking through the stable yard and the carriage house, with Philip explaining the practical aspects of what Louise would be inheriting. There were 8 horses in the driving establishment, ranging from the experienced competition horses to younger animals that were still in training. The carriages included everything from the elegant vehicle used for ceremonial occasions to the specialized competition carriages designed for different types of events. More significantly, Louise would be inheriting relationships with grooms, trainers, veterinarians, and other professionals who had worked with Philip for years. These people possessed decades of collective knowledge about carriage driving, and their continued involvement would be crucial to Louise's success. The most important thing to understand, Philip told Louise as they examined one of his favorite carriages, a beautiful vehicle that had carried him to victory in numerous competitions, is that this isn't just about you. You'll be responsible for all of these people, all of these animals, and for representing something much larger than yourself. As the day progressed, Louise found herself thinking not just about the excitement of the opportunity, but about the weight of responsibility that Philip was asking her to accept. She would be taking on commitments that would shape the rest of her life, pursuing a path that would be very different from what anyone had expected for the youngest granddaughter of the Queen. But there was something else that was becoming increasingly clear to Louise as she listened to her grandfather's vision for the future. This wasn't just about carriage driving or even about preserving traditions. Philip was offering her something that many people spend their entire lives searching for, a sense of purpose, a way to make a meaningful contribution to something larger than herself. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner at Windsor Castle, the conversation naturally turned to Louise's training and Philip's plans for the future. Louise noticed that her grandfather seemed more animated than he had been in months, energized by the prospect of seeing his life's passion carried forward by someone he loved and trusted. But she also noticed other things that concerned her. Philip seemed more fragile than usual, moving more slowly and tiring more easily. There were moments during the day when his legendary concentration had wavered, when he had paused mid-sentence as if gathering his strength to continue. Later that night, as Louise lay in bed thinking about everything that had been discussed, she realized that her grandfather's urgency wasn't just about wanting to see his plans implemented. Philip was racing against time, trying to prepare her for a responsibility that might come sooner than either of them wanted to acknowledge. The next morning brought one of their most intensive training sessions yet. Philip pushed Louise through increasingly complex scenarios, testing not just her technical skills, but her decision-making under pressure. They worked on competition-level obstacles, practiced emergency procedures for dealing with spooked horses, and spent time on the subtler aspects of horsemanship that could only be learned through experience and observation. But it was the conversation afterward that Louise would remember most vividly. As they walked back to the castle, Philip stopped suddenly and turned to face his granddaughter with an expression that was unusually serious, even for him. "Louise," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her pay attention immediately. "I want you to promise me something. Whatever happens in the coming weeks or months, I want you to remember that you have the strength and the character to handle this responsibility. Don't let anyone convince you that you're not ready or that you don't deserve this opportunity. Trust yourself, trust the horses, and trust what we've built together here." There was something in his tone that made Louise's heart skip, a finality that she didn't want to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. "Grandpa, are you feeling all right?" Philip smiled, but it was a smile that carried decades of experience with mortality and loss. "I'm feeling like a man who has lived a very full life and who has been blessed to see his granddaughter discover something that could give her own life real meaning. That's more than most people get, Louise. That's more than enough." They spent the rest of that week in intensive preparation, with Philip sharing not just practical knowledge, but also his philosophy about competition, about working with horses, and about representing something larger than oneself in the public eye. Louise absorbed everything, sensing that these might be among the last lessons her grandfather would be able to give her. on what would prove to be their final training session together. Philip gave Louise a gift that would become one of her most treasured possessions. It was a simple leather driving whip, worn smooth by decades of use, that had been Philip's companion through countless competitions and training sessions. "This has been with me for more than 40 years, he told her as he placed it in her hands. "It's carried me through victories and defeats, good days and bad days, and everything in between. I want you to have it now, not just as a tool, but as a reminder of everything we've talked about and everything I believe you can accomplish." Louise held the whip carefully, understanding that she was receiving far more than a piece of equipment. She was being entrusted with a tangible connection to her grandfather's legacy, a physical reminder of the trust he was placing in her and the expectations he had for her future. As they made their way back to the castle for what would be the last time together, Philip walking slowly but steadily beside his granddaughter, both of them were quiet, lost in their own thoughts about the past weeks and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Neither of them spoke the words that both were thinking, but both understood that something precious and irreplaceable was drawing to a close, even as something new and equally important was beginning to take shape. The morning of April 9th, 2021, dawned gray and somber over Windsor Castle, as if the very stones of the ancient fortress sensed that something momentous was about to occur. Louise had awakened early, as had become her habit during the weeks of intensive training with her grandfather, and she made her way to the stable yard expecting to find Philip already there, preparing for another day of lessons with his characteristic punctuality and attention to detail. But the stable yard was unusually quiet. The grooms were going about their morning duties with subdued efficiency, and there was an atmosphere of waiting, of holding breath, that seemed to permeate the entire establishment. Louise found herself standing alone among the horses that had become so familiar to her, feeling an inexplicable sense of unease that she couldn't quite identify. It was shortly after breakfast that the news came. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, had died peacefully in his sleep at Windsor Castle. At 99 years old, just 2 months before his 100th birthday, Philip had finally succumbed to the health issues that had been quietly undermining his strength for months, though he had fought against them with typical determination almost until the very end. For Louise, the news brought a grief that was both personal and profound. She had lost not just her grandfather, but her mentor, her teacher, and the person who had shown her a path toward a future she had never imagined possible. The man who had spent the last weeks of his life preparing her for a responsibility that now seemed overwhelming had left her to carry forward his legacy alone. The immediate aftermath of Philip's death was a whirlwind of protocol and ceremony that left little time for private grief. As a senior member of the royal family, Philip's death triggered a complex series of arrangements that had been planned in detail for years. Louise found herself swept up in the formal mourning period, attending meetings about funeral arrangements, receiving condolences from dignitaries and family friends, and trying to process her loss while maintaining the composed public face that was expected of a member of the royal family. But even in the midst of the formal proceedings, Louise's thoughts kept returning to the stable yard, to the horses that had been Philip's passion, and to the promise she had made to carry forward everything he had taught her. The practical questions were immediate and pressing. Who would care for Philip's horses? What would happen to his carriages and equipment? How would the various commitments and obligations he had undertaken be fulfilled? It was Sophie, Louise's mother, who first raised the question that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted a voice. 3 days after Philip's death, as the family gathered to discuss the practical arrangements that would need to be made, Sophie gently asked Louise whether she felt ready to take on the responsibility that Philip had been preparing her for. "I know this seems overwhelming right now," Sophie said, her voice gentle but clear, "and I want you to know that no one expects you to make any decisions while you're still grieving. But your grandfather spent weeks preparing you for this moment, and I think we need to consider what he would have wanted." Louise looked around the room at the faces of family members who were all dealing with their own grief while trying to support each other through this difficult time. She thought about Philip's final words to her, his insistence that she had the strength and character to handle whatever challenges lay ahead, and his conviction that she could give his life's passion a future that honored its past while adapting to modern realities. "I want to try," Louise said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I know I'm not ready, and I know I'll make mistakes. But Grandpa believed in me, and I think I owe it to him and to myself to at least try to live up to that belief." The decision, once made, set in motion a series of practical arrangements that would transform Louise's life in ways that extended far beyond her grief. Within days of Philip's funeral, a ceremony that was watched by millions around the world and that celebrated his 7 decades of service to the crown and to Britain, Louise found herself meeting with officials from various equestrian organizations, discussing how to maintain Philip's commitments while developing her own approach to carrying forward his work. The first major decision involved Philip's horses. The 8 animals that had been his partners in competition and training represented decades of careful breeding and selection. Each horse had its own personality, its own strengths and challenges, and its own relationship with Philip that could never be replicated. Louise would need to develop her own connections with these animals while respecting the training and care that Philip had invested in them. Working with Philip's longtime head groom, a quiet man named Thomas who had been with the establishment for over 20 years, Louise began the process of getting to know each horse as an individual. She spent hours in the stable yard, grooming and exercising the animals, learning their quirks and preferences, and gradually building the trust that would be essential for any future competition or training activities. The horses seemed to sense the change in their circumstances, and their reactions varied dramatically. Some, particularly the older and more experienced animals, appear to be grieving Philip's absence in their own way, becoming listless and unresponsive to training. Others, especially the younger horses, seemed to adapt more quickly to Louise's presence and to accept her as their new primary caregiver. Balmoral Nevis, the lead horse that had been Philip's favorite and Louise's primary partner during her training, presented the greatest challenge. The intelligent black gelding had been with Philip for over a decade, and his bond with the Duke had been so strong that he seemed unable to accept that his longtime partner was gone. For days after Philip's death, Nevis refused to eat properly, showed no interest in training, and displayed a melancholy that was heartbreaking to witness. It was during a quiet moment in Nevis's stall, as Louise sat on a hay bale, simply keeping the horse company, that she experienced one of the most powerful moments of connection with Philip's legacy. Nevis suddenly approached her, resting his great head against her shoulder in a gesture of trust and acceptance that brought tears to her eyes. In that moment, Louise felt that Philip was somehow present, that his love for these animals and their love for him would be the bridge that allowed her to continue what he had started. The technical aspects of maintaining Philip's establishment proved to be equally challenging. Louise had to learn not just about the day-to-day care of the horses, but about the complex world of competition regulations, breeding records, veterinary care, and equipment maintenance that underpin serious carriage driving. She spent long hours with Thomas and other members of Philip's team, absorbing information about feeding schedules, training regimens, and the subtle signs of illness or injury that required immediate attention. But perhaps the most daunting aspect of Louise's new responsibility was the public dimension. Philip had not just been a private enthusiast. He had been one of the most visible and influential figures in international carriage driving. His death had been noted in equestrian publications around the world, and there was intense interest in what would happen to his establishment and his various commitments to the sport. Louise's first public appearance as Philip's successor came just 6 weeks after his death, at a small driving event at Windsor that had been one of Philip's favorite annual competitions. Louise had debated whether she was ready for such a public debut, but ultimately decided that Philip would have wanted her to honor the commitment he had made to support the event. Driving Philip's familiar green carriage with Nevis and the rest of the team that had carried Philip to so many victories, Louise entered the arena to respectful applause from competitors and spectators who understood the significance of the moment. She was not competing. That would come later, when she had gained more experience. But her presence was a statement that Philip's legacy would continue. The drive itself was not technically perfect. Louise was still learning to manage the subtle communications required for public driving, where the presence of spectators and the formal atmosphere could affect even experienced horses. But what impressed observers was her composure and her obvious connection with the horses, qualities that reminded many of Philip himself in his early days of competition. After the event, Louise was approached by several veteran drivers who had known and competed with Philip for decades. Their words of encouragement and offers of assistance made Louise realize that she was not inheriting this responsibility alone. She was joining a community of people who shared Philip's passion and who were committed to helping her succeed. One conversation in particular stayed with Louise long after the event ended. An elderly German driver named Klaus Müller, who had been Philip's friend and rival for over 30 years, pulled Louise aside to share a story that revealed something important about Philip's character and his approach to the sport. "Your grandfather," Klaus said in his heavily accented English, "was never interested in winning just to win. He wanted to prove that the old ways, that the traditional methods of horsemanship, could compete successfully in a modern world. He believed that carriage driving was about more than sport. It was about preserving a connection to our past while creating something valuable for the future. That is what he has passed on to you, and that is what will make you successful." As the weeks passed, Louise began to settle into a routine that balanced her ongoing education with her new responsibilities. She continued her regular schooling. She was still only 17 and preparing for her A-levels, while spending every available moment in the stable yard, learning from Thomas and the other professionals who had worked with Philip. The horses gradually adapted to their new circumstances, though the adjustment was not without its challenges. Several times during those early weeks, Louise found herself dealing with situations that tested both her growing skills and her confidence. A training session where one of the younger horses spooked at a low-flying helicopter reminded her how quickly things could go wrong in carriage driving, while a minor injury to one of the team horses taught her about the constant vigilance required to keep such valuable animals healthy and sound. But there were also moments of pure joy that reminded Louise why Philip had loved this sport so passionately. A perfect training session where all four horses moved in complete harmony, responding to her lightest touch as if they could read her thoughts. An afternoon spent exploring new routes through Windsor Great Park, with the English countryside spread out before them and the ancient trees providing a cathedral-like setting for their passage. Most importantly, Louise began to understand that she was not just preserving Philip's legacy, but creating her own. While she would always honor the foundation he had built and the lessons he had taught her, she was developing her own style, her own approach to working with horses, and her own vision for what carriage driving could become in the 21st century. The transformation in Louise during those first months after Philip's death was remarkable to those who knew her well. The shy, reserved teenager who had always preferred to remain in the background was developing a quiet confidence and a sense of purpose that was evident to everyone around her. The responsibility for Philip's establishment had given her life a focus and direction that nothing else could have provided. As summer arrived at Windsor Castle, bringing with it the beautiful weather that made carriage driving such a pleasure, Louise found herself thinking often about Philip's final words to her, his insistence that she had the strength to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. She was beginning to understand that those words had been not just encouragement but prophecy. The gift Philip had given her was not just his horses and carriages, his knowledge and experience, or even his position in the carriage driving world. The real gift was the discovery of her own capabilities, the realization that she possessed strengths she had never recognized, and the understanding that she could make a meaningful contribution to something larger than herself. Standing in the stable yard on a warm evening in early summer, Watching the horses that had once been Philip's pride and joy and were now her responsibility, Louise felt a profound connection to her grandfather's memory and to the future he had envisioned for her. The grief would always be there. The loss of such an important mentor and beloved family member was not something that could ever be completely healed. But alongside the grief was something else: gratitude for the time they had shared, pride in what she was already accomplishing, and excitement about what the future might hold. Philip's heartfelt gift to his granddaughter was beginning to reveal its true scope. It was not just about preserving the past, but about creating possibilities for the future that neither of them could have imagined when they first began those lessons in the stable yard at Windsor Castle. By the autumn of 2021, 6 months after Prince Philip's death, Lady Louise Windsor had transformed from a grieving granddaughter into a determined young woman with a clear sense of purpose and an increasingly confident public presence. The shy teenager who had reluctantly accepted media attention was evolving into someone who understood that her unique position came with both privileges and responsibilities that extended far beyond her personal comfort zone. The turning point came in September at the World Carriage Driving Championships in Paris-du-Pin, France. Louise had not yet felt ready to compete at such a prestigious international event, but she attended as an official observer, representing both the British team and her grandfather's legacy in the sport. It was her first major appearance on the international carriage driving stage, and the pressure was immense. The championships brought together the world's finest drivers, including many who had competed with and against Philip for decades. Louise found herself welcomed into a community that regarded her not as an inexperienced teenager, but as the rightful inheritor of one of the sport's most respected legacies. The veteran drivers shared stories of Philip's competitive spirit, his innovations in technique and equipment, and his role in promoting carriage driving around the world. During the championship week, Louise had the opportunity to observe competitions at a level she had never seen before. The precision and skill required for international competition was far beyond anything she had experienced during her training with Philip, but watching these master drivers navigate complex courses with seemingly effortless grace gave her a new understanding of what she was ultimately working toward. More importantly, Louise began to see how Philip's vision for the future of carriage driving was being realized through her presence at the event. She was approached by journalists, photographers, and television crews who were interested in documenting the continuation of Philip's involvement in the sport through his granddaughter. While the media attention was sometimes overwhelming, Louise recognized that it was also an opportunity to promote carriage driving to audiences who might never have heard of the sport otherwise. The highlight of the championships for Louise came during the presentation of a special memorial award established in Philip's honor. The award recognized contributions to the development and promotion of carriage driving, and its inaugural recipient was Klaus Müller, the German driver who had been Philip's longtime friend and competitor. During his acceptance speech, Klaus spoke directly to Louise, acknowledging her commitment to carrying forward her grandfather's work and predicting that she would soon be competing at this same level. Prince Philip's greatest victory, Klaus said, his voice carrying across the arena to the assembled competitors and spectators, was not any championship he won, but the legacy he has created through Lady Louise. She represents the future of our sport, and I believe her grandfather will be very proud of what she has already accomplished. The speech brought Louise to tears, but they were tears of gratitude and determination rather than grief. For the first time since Philip's death, she felt truly connected to the international carriage driving community and confident in her ability to represent both her family and the sport with dignity and skill. Returning to Windsor after the championships, Louise threw herself into an intensive training program designed to prepare her for her first competitive appearance. Working with Thomas and a new coach recommended by the British Driving Society, she began to push both herself and Philip's horses to new levels of performance. The training was more demanding than anything Louise had experienced during her initial lessons with Philip. Competition driving required not just technical skill, but physical stamina, mental toughness, and the ability to make split-second decisions under extreme pressure. Louise discovered muscles she didn't know she had as she worked to develop the strength and endurance needed to control four powerful horses over challenging courses that might last for hours. But the most significant aspect of Louise's development was not physical, but psychological. The young woman who had spent her life avoiding the spotlight was learning to embrace the pressure and attention that came with competitive carriage driving. She was developing what coaches call competitive confidence, the ability to perform at her best when the stakes were highest and the most people were watching. This transformation was particularly evident during a training session in November when Louise faced her first serious accident. While practicing a challenging water obstacle, one of the wheel horses stumbled on the approach, causing the carriage to tip dangerously and threatening to overturn completely. In that instant, Louise had to make a choice that would determine not only her safety, but the well-being of four valuable horses. Instead of panicking or freezing, Louise reacted with instincts that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her training. She shifted her weight to counterbalance the carriage, used her reins to redirect the horses away from the obstacle, and brought the entire team to a controlled stop without injury to herself or any of the animals. The whole incident lasted less than 30 seconds, but it demonstrated that Louise had internalized Philip's teachings in a way that went beyond conscious knowledge. Thomas, who had witnessed the incident, later told Louise's parents that what he had seen was not just good reflexes or lucky instincts, but the kind of horsemanship that could only come from a deep understanding of carriage driving and a genuine partnership with the horses. She handled that situation exactly the way the Duke would have, he said. Not just the technical aspects, but the calmness under pressure. That can't be taught. It has to come from within. As winter approached, Louise began preparing for what would be her competitive debut, a regional championship event scheduled for the following spring. The decision to enter competition had not been made lightly. Louise, her family, and her advisors all understood that her first competitive appearance would attract significant media attention and would be seen as a test of whether she was truly ready to carry forward Philip's legacy. The preparation for competition involved not just Louise, but the entire establishment that Philip had built at Windsor. The horses had to be brought to peak fitness. The carriages had to be perfectly maintained and adjusted to Louise's specifications, and the support team of grooms and advisors had to be prepared for the logistical challenges of traveling to competitions with valuable animals and equipment. Louise also had to prepare herself mentally for the reality of public competition. Unlike the private training sessions at Windsor, competitive carriage driving involved performing in front of crowds, dealing with unpredictable weather and course conditions, and managing the stress of formal competition where mistakes would be both visible and potentially dangerous. During this period, Louise received unexpected support from an important source, her grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen had always shared Philip's love of horses, though her interests had focused primarily on racing and breeding rather than carriage driving. But she understood the significance of what Louise was undertaking and the importance of preserving Philip's legacy. In a private conversation at Balmoral Castle during the family's traditional Christmas gathering, the Queen spoke to Louise about the parallels between competitive carriage driving and royal duty. Both, she observed, require the ability to perform consistently under public scrutiny, the discipline to prepare thoroughly for every appearance, and the character to represent something larger than oneself with dignity and grace. Your grandfather, the Queen told Louise, always said that carriage driving taught him lessons about leadership and responsibility that served him well in his royal duties. I suspect you may find the reverse to be true, that what you learn about performing under pressure in competition will prepare you for whatever role you eventually choose to play in this family. The conversation with her grandmother gave Louise a new perspective on her carriage driving pursuits. She began to understand that what she was learning went far beyond sport or even the preservation of Philip's legacy. She was developing skills and confidence that would serve her well in whatever path her life eventually took. As spring arrived and Louise's competitive debut approached, the level of public interest was far greater than anyone had anticipated. Media outlets around the world were planning to cover her first competition, recognizing the human interest story of a young woman honoring her grandfather's memory while pursuing her own dreams in a demanding and potentially dangerous sport. Louise's first competition took place at the Sandringham Driving Trials, an event that Philip had helped to establish and had supported for decades. The choice of venue was deliberate. Competing at Sandringham would allow Louise to make her debut in familiar surroundings, with the support of local officials and spectators who remembered Philip fondly. The night before the competition, Louise spent time in the stable yard at Sandringham, checking on the horses and equipment one final time. As she stood with Balmoral Nevis, the lead horse who had been Philip's favorite and had become her closest partner among the team, she felt a profound sense of connection to her grandfather's memory and to the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Tomorrow, Nevis," she whispered to the big black gelding, "we get to show everyone what Grandpa taught us." The competition itself was both exhilarating and terrifying. Louise navigated the complex dressage phase with steady nerves, executed the challenging marathon course without major errors, and completed the final cones phase with only minor penalties. While her scores were not competitive with the most experienced drivers, her performance demonstrated clear competence and showed flashes of the brilliance that Philip had recognized in her potential. More importantly, Louise's conduct throughout the competition impressed observers who had known Philip well. She was gracious in dealing with media attention, respectful toward her competitors, and clearly passionate about the sport itself rather than just the attention it brought her. The veteran drivers who had been watching her progress since Philip's death began to speak openly about their belief that she had the potential for genuine competitive success. The conclusion of Louise's first competition marked not an ending, but a beginning. As she drove Nevis and the rest of Philip's team around the arena in the traditional victory lap. Not because she had won, but because she had successfully completed her debut, Louise understood that she had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. She was no longer just the granddaughter who was trying to preserve Philip's legacy. She was a carriage driver in her own right, someone who had proven her ability to compete at a serious level and who was beginning to develop her own reputation within the sport. The gift that Philip had given her, his knowledge, his horses, his position in the carriage driving world, was becoming something new, something that honored the past, while creating possibilities for the future that neither of them could have envisioned. As Louise made her way back to the stable area after the competition, she was surrounded by well-wishers, journalists, and fellow competitors who wanted to congratulate her on her successful debut. But in the midst of all the attention and excitement, Louise found herself thinking about Philip and the conversations they had shared during those precious weeks of training. She remembered his insistence that carriage driving was about more than sport or recreation, that it was about preserving traditions and skills that connected the modern world to its past. She thought about his prediction that this pursuit could give her life real purpose and meaning, and about his confidence that she had the character to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. Standing in the stable yard at Sandringham, with the horses that had once been Philip's pride and were now her responsibility, Louise realized that her grandfather's final gift had been even more precious than she had initially understood. He had not just given her horses and carriages and knowledge about a sport. He had given her the opportunity to discover who she really was, to develop confidence and skills she never knew she possessed, and to find a path through life that would allow her to honor his memory while creating her own legacy. The shy 17-year-old who had first climbed into Philip's carriage just a year earlier was gone, replaced by a young woman with clear goals, genuine confidence, and a deep understanding of both the privileges and responsibilities that came with her unique position. Philip's heartfelt gift to his granddaughter had accomplished something that no amount of money or status could have achieved. It had given Louise the foundation for a life of purpose, meaning, and genuine accomplishment. As she loaded the horses for the journey back to Windsor, Louise smiled as she thought about how proud Philip would have been of this day. But more than that, she was excited about the future and the competition's challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The gift Philip had given her was not just about preserving the past, but about creating a future that would honor his memory while allowing Louise to become the person she was meant to be.